All right, well, thank you. I'm Tony Smith, and I'll sort of get started here. I'm going to talk about setting how to determine whether medical testing risks are appropriate. I'm going to use COVID as a case study here to sort of work through this. So, medical advancements. Medical research has brought us wonderful advancements, including antibiotics like penicillin, vaccines like the polio and measles vaccine, and medical treatments and procedures like heart transplants, etc. However, not all of these new drugs and treatments that hit the market are as safe as effective as the sort of greatest hits list that I've sort of trouted out here. So, for example, elixir sulfonamide was distributed in 1937, and it resulted in 100 people dying from taking the drug. Now, the elixir sulfonamide contained diethyl glycol, which is used in antifreeze, and it wasn't tested before it sort of hit the market, and so the tablet and powder form of sulfonamide was effective in treating strep infections, and they wanted a liquid version of it, and that was never tested. It was tested for things like taste and for smell and that type of thing, but it wasn't tested for safety. It contained essentially antifreeze, and then that sort of resulted in a number of people getting sick and roughly 100 of them dying. We also have a thalidomide, which was used as a treatment for morning sickness, and resulted in a number of birth defects. By the time it was taken off the market, roughly 10,000 children had birth defects. And then sort of the last one sort of looking at here is more recent one is Vioxx. So Vioxx was a drug that was approved for treating heart attacks and vascular disease. But by the time it was pulled from the market, Vioxx had led to roughly 142,000 fatal cases of heart failure, heart attacks, and strokes. So medical research then is the sort of the sort of list here shows is risky business. It's rife with dangers and rewards. And so the goal of medical testing is to find safe and effective drugs and treatments to benefit the public. So we want to get out effective drugs that can help us treat diseases, help cure diseases, and things like that. But there's always the sort of risk that these things will either be ineffective or either worse, they'll sort of be unsafe. And especially when it comes to sort of medical testing, because you have these sort of concoctions that we have maybe theoretical reasons, maybe sort of basic science reasons to think that they will be safe, to think that they will help treat patients, but we don't really know. And so before they go to market, then these drugs first need to be tested to determine whether they are in fact safe and effective. Now, in the good old days, this usually meant the scientist or probably some poor research assistant, sticking the drug with them. They'd sort of test them on themselves. Now, with the advent of large-scale clinical trials, it means testing on others. And so rather than just sort of signing people up and injecting them with random concoctions, we want to know whether these medical trials are potentially too risky, whether the risk of testing this drug, even in small numbers, is just too risky for the trial patients. The issue here is that defining what counts as too risky has been elusive. It's been we don't quite have a clear definition of what it means to be too risky when it comes to sort of medical testing and approving new potential treatments. And what I want to sort of show here is I want to use looking at the testing for a COVID vaccine and use that as a case study to help us determine when, where, and why risks for medical testing can be acceptable and appropriate. So first, sort of look at two sort of the standard definitions of when risks are acceptable. The first is the US Code of Federal Regulations, and it says that risks to subjects are acceptable in relation to anticipated benefits, if any, to subjects and the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be expected to result. So here, the US Code of Federal Regulation defines acceptable risks as reasonable risks. Now compare this with what the World Medical Association says. They say that when risks are found to outweigh the potential benefits, physicians must assess whether to continue, modify, or stop the study. So the World Medical Association sort of says that risks are acceptable when they're outweighed by the benefits. Now, despite the similarities here, these are not identical. The World Medical Association seems to endorse something like a cost-benefit approach, where we look at the risks and benefits, and if the benefits are not greater than the risks, then we don't proceed. The World Medical Association standard seems to apply that as long as there is some N such that the benefits are greater than the benefits are greater than the risks, the rewards are greater than the risks, then the risks are justified. Now, I think we can sort of raise some questions for this, I think sort of generates the puzzle here that I'm going to take a look at. So say that the risks are such that if we get it wrong in whatever we're testing or whatever we approve, that 1 million lives are at stake. So we're risking 1 million lives. Now, let's say that if we succeed and we get a successful treatment, we can save 1 million plus 1. I'm not sure in this case that many people would accept this as an example of an acceptable risk. I'm not sure that the saving an additional life over the sort of loss of just, 1 million makes it acceptable. The one additional life saved makes this an acceptable risk. And this sort of, this is trying to illustrate a sort of general problem for the sort of World Health definition. Is the general idea is this, is that if the N that tips the scale in favor of the benefits is so small, especially in comparison to the risks being taken, then the net benefits might be negligible. And in that case, it might still be unreasonable, even though there's sort of a positive weighing of benefits to risks, even though the sort of benefits outweigh the risk, it still might be unreasonable and therefore unacceptable to take such risks. Either way, I think we have a puzzle. Is it enough that the rewards outweigh the risks, or must it be that the risks and rewards of medical research are reasonable? The puzzle doesn't end here. If it's the latter, if they must be reasonable, then we have a question about what counts as reasonable. What is a reasonable balance of risk and potential reward? If it's the former, then it's just a sort of balancing, then how do we know when rewards sufficiently outweigh the risks such that the risks are acceptable? What I wish to propose here is that what counts as reasonable depends on what values, goals, and outcomes matter, and therefore what kinds of outcomes we ought to prioritize. As I'll discuss below, using COVID as a case study, what counts as a reasonable risk depends on what attitudes towards risk are reasonable in this case. And this in turn depends on what potential outcomes matter more than others. So the normal pathway for the development of a vaccine is from preclinical trials to first in human testing or phase 1 trials to phase 2 and then on from there. Preclinical screening is used to check to see whether vaccines have the potential to cause harms, including deaths, before the drug is administered to humans. Vaccines moved to first in human testing, where the vaccine is then tested on a small number of healthy patients for potential deleterious effects to confirm that it is unlikely to be harmful to humans. If it is found to be safe, then it is tested on a slightly larger group for efficacy and side effects. And then once again, if it's found to be safe and suspected to be effective, Then it is given to hundreds or thousands in phase 3 testing to test to confirm its efficacy. Each of these phases takes on average a year or two. And the goal here then for each year that it sort of takes these steps and moves sort of to bigger and bigger groups, the goal is then to provide adequate time to vet the drug for safety and efficacy. However, COVID testing protocols, especially those of Moderna and Pfizer, are designed for speed. They're designed to get these vaccines out as quickly as possible. And this sort of makes sense. COVID is a highly infectious disease. To date, there have been over 150 million cases worldwide and over 3 million deaths. And this doesn't include the other loss of life from the pandemic, like drug overdoses, nor does it include the future harms from economic losses and lower earnings that will result from the pandemic. Given the rapid speed given the rapid spread of the disease and the large loss of life, it makes sense to want to get a vaccine out as quickly as possible. Waiting to reach herd immunity without a vaccine entails a much larger loss, both in terms of economics, health, and sheer loss of life. The average time that it takes to get a drug from clinical testing to submitting for approval from the FDA on average is roughly 6 years. And so if we look at sort of the standard trajectory of sort of testing, it's roughly 6 years from starting clinical trials to being able to submit for FDA approval. Now, what we have here is we have roughly 4 different companies that have done all of this in under a year, from starting testing to submitting to even getting it approved. So if you include the approval process, in fact, then the average time is sort of longer. It's more like 7 or 8 years to get it sort of done. And we have a procedure that on average takes 6 to 8 years. And we have 4 different companies that have all done it in under a year. This is an extraordinarily quick time. However, increasing the speed of getting the vaccine out also increases the chances that we will miss potential adverse effects. One really important effect here is vaccine enhancement. Coronaviruses like COVID-19 carry the added potential for vaccine enhancement. Vaccine enhancement occurs when patients who have been given the vaccine have an increased negative response to being exposed to the virus. If vaccine enhancement results from a COVID-19 vaccine, the vaccine could cause treated patients to have a heightened response rather than being protected from the infection. Patients could develop severe symptoms of COVID-19 like acute pneumonia, respiratory failure, and perhaps even die as a result of the vaccine. Without taking the time to test a vaccine, we might not have a proper indication when it hits the market of whether or not the vaccine might have these and others deleterious effects, something that it kind of seems that we're struggling with right now with the sort of Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine. We can represent these choices here in terms of a decision tree. Speeding up testing gives us a greater chance at getting a vaccine out quickly, but it also increases the chances of producing an ineffective and unsafe vaccine, particularly one with vaccine enhancement. We get an increased chance at a better potential outcome, a quicker turnaround on the vaccine, which potentially spares those lives that would have been lost had the vaccine taken longer. But it also increases the chances of getting a worse potential outcome, an unsafe vaccine with vaccine enhancement. Here we have a larger spread in the potential outcomes, higher potential highs with lower potential lows. Speeding up the trial is a risky strategy. Taking our time to properly vet the vaccine decreases our chances of getting an unsafe and ineffective vaccine, but it also means that we have less of a chance at getting it out quickly. Properly vetting the vaccine means that there is a less of a chance of vaccine enhancement, and this means that there is less of a chance that the vaccine itself will make matters worse. It means that we won't have people getting jabbed with what they think is an effective vaccine, believing that they're protective when in fact they are not, and potentially increasing the spread of the virus paired with the potential for them to have a much more acute reaction to the virus themselves. We can avoid these unseemly we can avoid the unseemly consequences that an ineffective and unsafe vaccine creates by slowing down and taking adequate time to test it. But it also means that the longer it takes to get the vaccine out to the public increases the potential number of people who will succumb to complications from the virus, both medically and economically. The spread here is decreased. It increases the chances that we get a safe vaccine, but it decreases the chances that we get it quickly. We have a lower chance of a really poor outcome, but we also have a lower chance of a really excellent outcome. Slowing down the procedure is a less risky venture. So we have two different procedures for vetting a COVID vaccine. One is riskier than the other. The slower the procedure has thinner tails. The riskier one is, the risk is more heavily concentrated in the middle. The quicker procedure has thicker tails. It's more concentrated in the best and worst. Which procedure is appropriate depends on which risks are reasonable. Whether we should prefer more risk or less risk then tells us which procedure we ought to favor. This in turn depends on what our attitudes towards risk ought to be. This is a matter of our risk profiles and whether COVID provides a reason for us to decrease the amount of risk we tolerate in testing a vaccine. Now we can tease out our tolerance for risk by looking at two different gambles. Risk-averse agents are less tolerant of risk, as where risk-neutral agents are risk-seeking. Risk-neutral or risk-seeking agents are more tolerant. So take a gamble. Gamble one gives you a 50% chance of getting $0 and $100, where gamble two gives you a sure thing of getting $50. And the expected utility of both of these cases are $50. So we can explain and define these attitudes using this sort of example. So risk-averse agents prefer gamble two. Why? The worst potential outcome in gamble one is lower than in gamble two. Risk-averse agents want to avoid ending up with the worst potential outcome, or at least they want to decrease the chances that they end up with the worst potential outcome. Hence, they seek and opt for the gamble that gives them a better chance of avoiding this outcome. What matters to risk-averse agents is avoiding the worst potential outcomes such that they prioritize gambles that afford them the best opportunity of avoiding such an outcome, even if this means decreasing the chances of getting an even better potential outcome. Risk-seeking agents, on the other hand, prefer gamble one. So they want the gamble. They don't want the sure thing. They want to gamble. And why? Well, the best potential outcome in gamble one is higher than in gamble two. Risk-seeking agents want to get the best potential outcome, or at least they want to increase the chances that they end up with the best potential outcome, even if this means increasing the chances of ending up with the worst. Hence, they seek and opt for the gamble that gives them a better chance of getting such an outcome. What matters to risk-seeking agents is getting the best potential outcomes such that they prioritize gambles that afford them the best opportunity of doing so, even if this increases the chances that they get the worst potential outcome. Now, risk-neutral agents are sort of indifferent between the two gambles. Why? Well, because they have the same expected utility. Risk-neutral agents look at the expected utility and choose the one that maximizes or gives them the best expected utility. Why? Because they don't prioritize one potential outcome over the other. They see the best and the worst as mattering equally and fully sort of defined and explained by the utilities of those potential outcomes. Since they matter equally, all that matters is the expected utility of the gamble. What matters then to risk-neutral agents is the expected utility, and they prioritize gambles that afford them the greatest expected utility. And so when it comes to risk attitudes then is about determining what matters and therefore what ought to be prioritized, getting the best or avoiding the worst. If what matters is getting the best, then we ought to be risk-seeking. If what matters is avoiding the worst, then we ought to be risk-averse. And if these are of equal importance, then we ought to be risk-neutral. Now, I think when it comes to risk profiles and rationality, we tend to think that agents are free to set these attitudes according to their own preferences. Rational agents tend to value different outcomes differently, and as long as they structure their means and reasoning Accordingly, there's nothing irrational in having one risk profile versus another. However, when it comes to interpersonal choices, it is not a matter of personal preference, but a matter of what we ought to value, whether we ought to value getting the best or avoiding the worst. That is, it's a matter of what we have reason to prioritize. And so I think we can apply this to the COVID vaccine. So the question is what matters for a COVID vaccine? The best potential outcome of getting it out quickly, or avoiding the worst potential outcome, that is avoiding an unsafe and ineffective vaccine. And this lets us reframe the questions about a procedure for the COVID vaccine. If what matters is getting the vaccine out quickly, then we ought to prioritize the pathway that increases our chances of getting a vaccine quickly. And this means prioritize getting the best potential outcome. That is, getting the vaccine out quickly in order to potentially save more lives gives us a reason to increase the risks that we take in pursuit of a vaccine. And this means taking a riskier path to getting a vaccine. If what matters is avoiding an unsafe vaccine with potential vaccine enhancement, then the increased risks are not reasonable. We ought to prioritize not speed, but safety. If we ought to prioritize not speed, but safety, then we ought to prioritize avoiding the worst potential outcome. Accordingly, avoiding an unsafe and ineffective vaccine provides us with a reason to decrease the riskiness of the procedure, and we should have taken a less risky path to getting the vaccine. Instead, we should have slowed down our testing such that we increase the chances of avoiding an unsafe and ineffective vaccine. Which risk we ought to take is a matter of determining what matters, which potential outcomes we ought to prioritize, and the reasons that we ought to take. What counts as reasonable then when it comes to testing, medical testing and medical approval then is a matter of prioritizing potential outcomes. It is a matter of appropriately setting our risk attitudes. Thanks.